a student at UNC in Chapel Hill is when the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed. And there were other students in my program who were much more sort of excited about that law being passed and what that would mean for disabled children. But I hadn't gotten enough of an awareness yet. I never thought that you could say that people with disabilities were discriminated against until after I met Deborah Cunningham.
Right. She talks about how your generation had to learn
Yeah.
the word discrimination.
Yes.
And what that
And
what that meant.
Right. And I learned from hearing them talk about it eventually, because I learned from going with Deborah Cunningham to the Gini conferences here in St. Louis, and people were here from that activist group, Judy included, and Ed Roberts. So she didn't mention him at all in this presentation, and I kind of found that interesting, because I think that he's not the only one, but he's a very important part of our history.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's interesting that she didn't even describe the things that she ended up doing in Berkeley, the Independent Living Center there.
Yeah, totally. I have a thought for you around all this.
Okay, good.
Okay. She didn't, because she wasn't doing a history.
Yeah.
Right? That wasn't the goal of the interview.
Right.
Right? It was about this kind of, why are we telling stories?
Yeah.
You know? And so she was looking at just like a little bit of her background. And
Yeah.
kind of doing a survey of some of the history and answering some of the questions, but really focusing on what is the next step in the movement. And for her, it's telling stories.
Yes, and I appreciate that.
Individual stories,
yes.
not the historical stories.
Right,
Story,
not
the
whole,
big story.
Not the whole movement story.
Right,
yeah.
not the main through line big historical story.
Right.
So I have a question for you.
Okay.
So you didn't get a lot of that until you got to Deborah.
Mm-hmm.
But there was still stuff happening in your life.
Yes.
Leading up to that. And there was still stuff you were thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And you were coming more and more into this place of mixing of ideas, of disability, of maybe you weren't even using that language, but your experience on the planet and history and education and your interest in the humanities, and you're coming into this like, why isn't my experience in those places? So my question for you is that we might not be talking about what's your story in terms of the political thread, but let's say what's your story in terms of when you started to really like push for disability stuff as a humanities issue in academia. And the reason I'm asking you that or saying that is because one of the things I don't think you and I have thought about yet is what you would say in answer, same way they asked Judy, why did you get to that place? What was happening that led you to the necessity of pushing for that? And then also, where are we now in that work? Where do you want that to go next? If the movements aren't done, right? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the pieces of the movement. Where do you want that to go next? Do you vision around that? Do you think about it? Sometimes you look at Truman and go, what's going on with their disability studies program? But that's one little anecdote, and I imagine you have a much bigger curiosity or answer to where have we gotten, what else is there that needs to get done?
So there's a lot of things I'd like to answer to you.
Mm-hmm.
And what were the things in my life that made me start thinking about disability and culture, say?
Mm-hmm.
And I know exactly when I formulated those thoughts in my mind. Ellen was 1 year old, and I was home with her, taking a break in my studies.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that I had lived as a disabled person and a special education professional in two different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And I also realized that the only people in the academy that were all interested in focusing on disability issues were the medical people, social workers, therapists of different kinds, and none of them were interested in culture and history.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I was reading articles about, there were people who tried to do studies across different countries, and they called cultural disabilities a nuisance factor and tried to statistically eliminate the importance of cultural disabilities.
What do you mean when you say cultural disability?
The way that a culture responds to the disability.
Okay.
And I knew so clearly how it was different to be disabled here than it was in Norway.
And so they found it to be a confound that they were trying to eliminate as opposed to something to study.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or understand, or even
Right.
explore further.
Right.
So I had those thoughts myself, and I even wrote some little proposal. I wonder if I still have that in my papers, and I submitted it to one of Jerry's history professors at UNC. Now he told me that it wasn't really fully enough developed or something. He was kind of dismissive of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think he has a different view of it now. But anyway, I didn't get anywhere, but I had those thoughts way before I met Deborah Cunningham.
Mm-hmm.
But what she did was help me connect with all the stuff that was happening in this country politically,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the disability movement and the people
Mm-hmm.
who were doing things, because I had my thoughts just all alone by myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know exactly when it was, but at some point the people who were doing the disability rights movement started getting involved in academic type of activities. So especially this guy at Brandeis, Irv Zola, and he helped organize the first meeting of the Society for Disability Studies. And I submitted a paper and gave a presentation at that very first meeting, Culture and Disability, something or another, I forget now. So I brought that idea to wherever I went from as soon as I could or would.
Mm-hmm.
I used to a little bit tell Deborah Cunningham that I thought that the whole independent living philosophy and all of the things that I learned how to think about disability from her, that it should be something that you could get support for from the academy, from universities. And she didn't want to be connected with a university at all because she was convinced that disabled people would lose control. Now, of course, later on, I met Carol Gill, and she stayed in control, and she got the university to start the first in this country master's and PhD in disability studies. And she started writing about disability culture not long after I had, maybe even at the same time. At first there was a publication called the Disability Rag, and she was interviewed for that, and that was published in the Rag. And then I wrote a response to that interview that was published in the Rag. I have a copy of that somewhere, and it was just the same kind of thoughts that Carol had, but maybe a different slant because I came from somewhere else. But that's how I first sort of knew about Carol Gill. I met her in person after I had left Memphis and had started the center in Chattanooga, and I went to visit the Independent Living Center in Los Angeles. And Carol was then on the board there, and I was at a board meeting and met her.
What does it mean to you that you met her and knew her, and where are we at now?